mentioned in the past, though, that I actually do want to reference before we leave that topic completely about the Tencent thing. This is why I found it so incredibly annoying that there's this weird group of people, right? I thought there was just two groups of people, and the division went like this. You either are in favor of the Saudis buying into and operating esports stuff, or you're not. There's a third group who don't give a flying fuck who owns what, but they're really angry that we are correctly, factually, and justifiably calling out the people who are hypocrites for working with the Saudis. That's their only position. They're not against the Saudis. They're not for the Saudis. They're just annoyed that we're calling it out. And their only tool, Rich will know this, is whataboutism. So famously, in Counter-Strike, where they don't know about League and Tencent, they just say, but what about the time the US Army sponsored the US? They do that thing as if, again, the US Army / the US government actually like owned or operated like fucking the tournament, which obviously they never came close to. That's a ridiculous equivalence, right? And then similarly, in League, the same people would be like, oh, over in CS, you've got all that Saudi stuff. Thankfully, here in League of Legends, we don't have that. Yeah, it just turns out the whole time you were an actual adjunct to the military apparatus of the fucking Chinese Communist Party and state. That is who you were the whole time, my dude. So you know what? Here's a little detail for you. You know, back in the day when Riot used to actually pay the pro players their salaries, that means essentially the Chinese government on some level was overseeing the paying of Western professional League of Legends players. So again, I don't really think that that is actually some like normal situation. That seems pretty extreme to me. So similarly, if you believe, for example, that someone following Thorin on Twitter means you agree with all of his opinions and takes, then logically you agree with all the opinions of the Chinese military and state. Like, seems like kind of a crazy angle, but you guys set that standard, not me.
My other favorite whataboutism is people will say, well, why don't you criticize the Chinese government that owns Riot? Well, first off, the Chinese government doesn't. They're actually owned by a publicly traded company. And yes, by the way, guys, if anybody has complained about the Chinese connections with Riot, it's been us, by the way. It's not like we haven't mentioned it. Yep. we did it on this podcast. Why is that problematic? Because obviously the Chinese government is an authoritarian piece of shit that oppresses people like the Uyghurs. We don't like that either. And we have talked about that. We have talked about that. Absolutely, so it's like people, what I love is people use whataboutism. Like, why aren't you talking about this stuff without knowing or even looking to see if we actually have talked about it? Which we have. It's
also mental that they ever imply it to Richard, because he's probably the only person I'm aware of who's really famous in esports who has continually talked about the Uyghurs. Yeah. I'm aware of almost no one else.
Also pushing the Hong Kong thing, which you all forgot about. Remember how Free Hong Kong was a fucking hashtag for a week?
And remember how I was the only one to talk about how when the Free Hong Kong thing happened in esports, that what Riot Games did was their next Worlds after that happened was in China, and they put the entire broadcast on a 5-minute delay so that if anybody said Free Hong Kong, they would just cut the feed before it reached anybody.
Yep.
So you know, there you go.
Guys, we try. It's very hard. Like, obviously, you're not going to be on the right side on every topic, and sometimes there are even going to be inconsistencies and idiosyncrasies within your own logic. You know, that's just the nature of being human. Some issues and topics resonate more with you than other topics, and sometimes you can't see the in to have the necessary levels of empathy and understanding to be sympathetic to one cause over another. That's all fine. And all we want to do is just hold that mirror up and just say, you have said this about this group, and you have broadly attacked us for views that we don't even hold, that you deem to be reprehensible. But now you are aligned on a financial and business level with an entity that absolutely, inarguably holds the views you ascribe to us. So what up with that? And that's it. And that's why they hate it. It's not so much that they hate the fact that they're being called out for being hypocrites. That, you know, that's going to happen from time to time as a public figure. Most people have a thick enough skin for that. They don't even hate the fact that the Saudi Arabian government are doing those things. They don't care. They don't give a fuck about that. But what they absolutely do give a fuck about is when suddenly one fucking cluster of villains is allowed to have the moral high ground and the moral superiority over them, oh, they fucking hate that.
I actually did reference this one time, by the way, in one of my petty grievances, where I just said they accidentally did the Norm Macdonald meme. If people don't know the meme, essentially is the idea of like his biggest fear, Monty,
dirty bomb went off over LA.
Went off and killed millions of Americans is like by Islamic terrorists. What would the like judgment of Islamic people be? Well, the joke of the meme there, Monty, is the bigger concern should be the bomb killing all the people, obviously not like what the media backlash should be. So they did the meme, right? Because the joke is, I've actually seen this tweet before. There are people, Monty, who said that the worst thing about the Saudi Arabian involvement in esports is that people like Richard Lewis and Thorin get to be right about it. And it's like, no, the worst part is where they cut the people's heads off and put them in prison. You've got the part where he's wrong, you know.
A better example, still using Norm Macdonald, was when he was on the Seinfeld show, Comedians Get Coffee or whatever it was. And they're talking about Bill Cosby, and Seinfeld goes to Norm Macdonald. He goes, that's the thing with Bill Cosby. I think the worst part about it was the hypocrisy. And Norm Macdonald goes, I think it was the rapes. So, you know, it just, Seinfeld just cracks up because obviously, yes, you know, that is. But it's that glib thing people say. People become frivolous because ultimately you are detached from the horror of whatever it is that you're talking about, and what you're connected to is this little sociological, you know, kind of connectivity with other people in your space and their opinions and their behaviors. You can relate to that. You can engage with that. You can't engage with what the people were doing. That was horrifying and evil. So, I mean, look, that's to put a pin in it, that we've been pretty consistent across the board. I get called a Zionist these days. Apparently, I'm not sympathetic enough on Palestine.
By the way, I'll tell you what would prove otherwise. And this, if this ever happens, it's very unlikely, obviously. Spoiler, if Israel had control of a video game or tournament organizer, Richard would talk about that too. By the way, if the UK did, that's the dumbest part about it.
It's always done it over Denmark with Blast.
It's always a moron who doesn't seem to know us, who tells us what our opinions about other stuff they don't know about are. Like, I think we've actually been fairly consistent, like you said, over on this topic, even though, by the way, it is almost impossible to be consistent. As you just point out, you can't know every cause, can you? No one can.
On my Substack annual summary of the esports year, every year I give a word to the esports year. That's been, you know, so like, you know, 2022 was year of the scumbags. That's when Bobby Kotick was on his bullshit and stuff. So 2024 was the year of the sellout, and I talk about how, like, we've essentially become a governmental plaything. Like, even more broadly than football or any other popular sport. I mean, sports and politics will always intersect because of the bread and circuses paradigm. That's just the reality of it. But I mean, you know, we've become now the underwriters of esports are governments. You know, when you've got the Danish government fucking with PGL in Denmark because they're a competitor in a stadium that that Blast operate at traditionally, putting on a better show, and they literally send government representatives to the event to tell them, you better not show that sponsor and you better not show that sponsor. And what up with Russians competing here when the Danish Minister of Culture went to a Blast event prior to that and literally introduced Russian players on stage? You know, so it's like no good comes of being an off ramp of government. And the Danish government, what have they ever fucking done? You know what I mean? Like, it's a big scandal if someone gets caught drink driving over there. Yeah. That's like 101 for Americans. You have to do that before you even get invited to Epstein's Island. So, you know, it's like no good comes of being adjacent to any government. I don't want governmental control over esports. Right. Like, I liked it when we were a bunch of fucking peaceniks smoking weed, watching video games, making just enough money to fucking counterculture and do it again. It was counterculture. Yeah, exactly. Now it certainly is not counterculture. It was the one thing I didn't anticipate. You know, it's the one thing I feel guilty about in terms of my contribution to esports. I was one of the people steering us towards, no, Thorin, look, there's a lighthouse. We certainly will. The lighthouse of the mainstream. We'll never hit these rocks. Don't worry about it. I'm feeling invincible. And yeah, we went into the rocks, and now we're trash, and now we're garbage, and I helped get us there, you know, like, well,
so. But this is, you know, this is
you live and you learn.
See more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.